March 1910. Portland, Oregon bustled as a gateway city where East met West. Steamships arrived daily at the Willamette River docks. Timber barons built fortunes overnight, and the smell of sawdust from the mills mixed with fresh rain that fell almost constantly. It was a city reinventing itself after the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition, where people from across America came seeking new beginnings. Catherine Moore was 27 when she first walked down the brick-paved streets of downtown Portland. Dressed in mourning black, her widow's veil partially concealed her face as she made her way toward Pioneer Courthouse Square. She had just buried her husband in San Francisco after only 8 months of marriage, an arrangement between families, as was customary then, where love never had a chance to bloom. Her late husband's family expected Catherine to return to her parents' home in Sacramento. After all, a young childless widow should be under family supervision. But Catherine shocked everyone by firmly refusing. She said she would stay in Portland. She said she would start her own business. Her aunts were scandalized, her cousins whispered about impropriety, but Catherine had already made her decision. For the first time in her life, she had a modest inheritance that allowed her to choose, and she chose freedom. She checked into the Imperial Hotel near the riverfront, but the place was expensive and noisy. She needed to find a decent boarding house where she could live while planning her next steps. That's how, on that Sunday morning, she headed to First Presbyterian Church for the 10 o'clock service. Margaret Sullivan sat 3 pews behind Catherine. She was 30 years old, with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands from years of hard work. She was a housekeeper in one of Portland's wealthiest homes, managing domestic affairs 7 days a week, with only 1 day off per month. That Sunday morning, her only free day, Margaret wore her best navy dress and attended church, as she did every month. When the minister concluded the blessing and the women began filing out of the church, their eyes met by chance on the front steps. Catherine stood still, observing the busy square, when she stumbled slightly on a loose brick. Margaret, who was right behind her, instinctively caught her arm to prevent the fall. "Thank you," Catherine said, adjusting her veil. "You're welcome, ma'am," Margaret responded, lowering her gaze politely. But in that brief touch, something happened. A second that lasted longer than it should. An inexplicable recognition, as if 2 solitary souls had, for an instant, seen in each other the possibility of no longer being alone. Catherine broke the silence. "Excuse me for bothering you, but do you know any good boarding houses in Portland? I'm staying at the Imperial Hotel, but I need something more permanent." Margaret hesitated for a moment, then answered, "I live in a boarding house in the Old Town district, near the waterfront. It's simple, but clean and honest. The owner, Mrs. Pemberton, takes good care of her guests. I believe there's a vacant room on the upper floor. Could you take me there?" Catherine asked, and there was something in her voice that wasn't just a request for information, but a genuine desire to prolong this encounter. Margaret agreed. They walked together through Portland streets, talking about the city, about the weather, about life near the waterfront. Catherine mentioned she was a recent widow, that she came from San Francisco, that she intended to open some type of business. Margaret spoke of her work as a housekeeper, the difficulty of the hours, the distance from the family she'd left behind in rural Washington years ago. The Riverside boarding house was a 2-story wooden building with green shutters and a front porch where some guests sat drinking coffee. Mrs. Pemberton, a 50-year-old widow from Massachusetts, received Catherine cordially and showed her the available room on the 2nd floor. It was small, but had a window overlooking the street and a well-kept iron bed. Catherine accepted immediately. She moved in 3 days later, bringing only 2 suitcases and a box with personal belongings. During the first weeks, Catherine and Margaret maintained polite conversations in the hallways. Comments about the weather, complaints about the food served by Mrs. Pemberton, nothing more. But something was growing in the silence between words, a mutual attention disguised as courtesy. Margaret always saved an extra roll from breakfast for Catherine. Catherine always asked if Margaret had arrived safely from the house where she worked. The other boarding house guests didn't notice anything. They were mostly men, timber merchants, traveling salesmen, temporary dock workers. There were 2 other women, an elderly lady visiting her sick son, and a school teacher who gave private lessons. Everything changed in May 1910. Margaret arrived at the boarding house in the middle of the afternoon, something unprecedented, as her work only ended at 8 in the evening. She was pale, with red eyes, carrying a small suitcase. Catherine, who was sitting on the porch reading the newspaper, immediately stood up. What happened? Margaret couldn't answer right away. She entered the boarding house, climbed the stairs to her room, and Catherine followed her. When she finally managed to speak, the words came out broken. I was dismissed. The mistress accused me of stealing jewelry. I didn't steal anything, Catherine. I swear I didn't. But she said she saw the gold bracelet in my room. It wasn't mine. I'd never seen it before. I think someone placed it there to frame me. Why would they do that? Because her daughter wants to hire a cousin who's arriving from Boston. They needed an excuse to send me away without paying the 3 months they owe me. The accusation was false, but it didn't matter. A wealthy mistress's word was worth infinitely more than a housekeeper's. Margaret was expelled without references, which meant she would never get decent work in Portland again. No one would hire a maid accused of theft. Catherine held Margaret's hands. Do you have savings? Only enough for 2 more months of rent here at the boarding house. After that, Margaret didn't complete the sentence. Both knew what happened to women without family, without work, without references. That night, Catherine stayed in Margaret's room until late. They talked about alternatives, about possibilities, about uncertain futures, and it was there, in the dim light of a candle, that Catherine made the most important decision of her life. I have my husband's inheritance. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to buy a small business. I was thinking about opening a boarding house, alone. I wouldn't know where to start. But you worked in wealthy homes. You know how to manage, how to take care of everything. Catherine paused, then said the words that would change their lives. Let's do this together. 50-50. Partners. Margaret looked at Catherine as if she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. Are you serious? Completely. Catherine, you barely know me. Why would you do this? Catherine could have given a practical answer. Something about needing an experienced partner, about the good business opportunity. But instead, she told the truth. Because I trust you, and because I don't want to do this alone. There was something in the unspoken words that both understood, a connection that had no name, that couldn't be named, but was more real than any contract. Margaret simply said, yes. If you're following this story of courage and new beginnings, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow this entire emotional journey that's just beginning. Over the next 3 months, Catherine and Margaret searched Portland for the perfect property. They visited deteriorated buildings, houses too small, properties too expensive, until, in August 1911, they found what they were looking for, a 3-story wooden building on Washington Street, just 2 blocks from the waterfront. The place was in terrible condition. It had water damage in the walls, broken windows, a permanent smell of mildew, and a backyard overgrown with weeds. But it had 11 rooms, a prime location near merchants and travelers, and a price that fit exactly within their budget. The owner, a failed merchant moving back to New England, accepted the offer without many questions. On August 15, 1911, Catherine Moore and Margaret Sullivan signed the deed of purchase. 2 women, without husbands, without families supervising, buying property together. The notary raised an eyebrow, but the money was there, complete and in cash. There was no legal reason to refuse. As they walked back to the Riverside boarding house with the deed in hand, Catherine asked, "What shall we call our boarding house?" Margaret looked at the sky. It was late afternoon, and the horizon over the river was painted orange and pink. "How about the morning star? It's a new beginning." "The morning star," Catherine repeated, and smiled for the first time in months. Perfect. They didn't know, at that moment, that this would be just the first step of a journey lasting nearly 4 decades, a journey built in silence, in discreet glances, in carefully planned decisions. A journey of love that could never be proclaimed, but would be lived every day, in every brick laid, in every bill paid, in every choice made together. The renovation of the Morning Star took 6 months. Catherine and Margaret worked from dawn to dusk, hiring carpenters, painters, plumbers. They spent every penny of Catherine's inheritance and Margaret's savings. There were days when they ate only bread and coffee, saving to buy paint or nails. Margaret, with her experience in affluent homes, knew exactly what quality guests expected. Clean sheets changed weekly, basin and pitcher of fresh water in each room, hearty breakfast served between 6 and 8 in the morning. Catherine, who had formal education and could read and write well, handled the administrative side, guest registries, expense control, tax payments. They divided tasks with military precision. Margaret woke at 5 in the morning to prepare coffee, bake bread, arrange tables. Catherine handled collections, correspondence, conversations with suppliers. In the afternoon, while Margaret supervised room cleaning, Catherine did the shopping at the market. At night, after serving dinner, they did the accounts together in the small first-floor office. The Morning Star opened its doors in March 1912. In the first month, they had only 3 guests. In the second, 6. In the third, all 11 rooms were occupied, and there was a waiting list. The location was perfect. Timber merchants who came to negotiate at the docks stayed there. Travelers waiting for ships lodged for weeks. Families from rural areas who came to conduct business in Portland found at the Morning Star cleanliness, good food, and honest prices. But the real differential was the management. Catherine and Margaret worked as if they were one person. When one was tired, the other took over. When there was a problem, they solved it together. They never argued in front of guests, always maintained a polite and professional demeanor. In public, they were Miss Catherine and Miss Margaret. They spoke only about business, maintained appropriate physical distance, referred to each other as my partner, with impeccable formality. But at night, when the last guest went up to his room and the boarding house finally fell silent, they climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, where they had their private rooms. They locked the door, and there they were simply themselves. They talked about plans for the future, about difficult guests and polite ones, about bills that needed to be paid. Catherine read aloud excerpts from newspapers. Margaret sewed or embroidered. Sometimes they just sat in silence, side by side, and that comfortable silence was more eloquent than any words. No one asked questions because, in Portland in 1911, 2 single women managing a boarding house together wasn't exactly common, but also wasn't scandalous enough to cause problems. As long as they maintained appearances, as long as they were discreet, they could exist. In December 1913, 2 years after opening the boarding house, Catherine and Margaret had paid off all renovation debts and still had savings growing each month. That's when something happened that could have destroyed everything. One of the regular guests, an Irish merchant named Mr. O'Brien, began asking questions. Questions about why 2 young women were living together without families. Questions about why they never received visits from suitors. Questions that always came with a false smile and inquisitive eyes. One night, after dinner, Mr. O'Brien approached Catherine in the hallway. He was visibly drunk. "Miss Catherine, a beautiful woman like yourself should be married, caring for a family. What a waste to stay here managing a boarding house. I appreciate your concern, Mr. O'Brien, but I'm satisfied with my life," Catherine responded, trying to pass. He blocked the way. "Maybe you need a man to show you what you're missing." Before Catherine could respond, Margaret appeared at the end of the hallway, carrying a stack of clean linens. Her voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "Mr. O'Brien, I believe you've had too much to drink tonight. I suggest you go to your room." The man looked from Catherine to Margaret, then back to Catherine. There was something dangerous in his gaze, a suspicion beginning to form, but he was too drunk to articulate it, and there were other guests coming down the stairs. He muttered something inaudible and went up to his room. That night, Catherine and Margaret talked seriously. They knew they needed to be even more careful. A rumor, a suspicion, and everything they had built could crumble. In Portland in 1913, 2 women living together might be tolerated, but if someone made explicit what was implicit, the consequences would be devastating. "We need to be untouchable," Catherine said. "Our reputation needs to be above any suspicion." "How?" "We go to church every Sunday. We make donations to the church. We participate in charity work. We keep the boarding house impeccable, and we never give reason for comments." That's how Catherine and Margaret became constant presences at First Presbyterian Church. They sat in separate pews, never beside each other. After the service, they greeted the ladies of Portland society. talked about the weather, about the city's growth. They made a point of being seen, of being known as two hardworking, religious, and respectable women. The strategy worked. In 1914, when World War I broke out in Europe, the impact on the American economy was immediate. Timber exports dropped drastically. Many merchants in Portland went bankrupt. Boarding houses and hotels began closing for lack of guests. But the Morning Star survived. And it survived because Catherine and Margaret did something smart. They lowered prices to attract dock workers who previously couldn't afford decent accommodation. They adapted the menu to be more economical, but still ample. They offered credit to longtime guests who were going through difficulties. The generosity wasn't just kindness, it was investment in reputation. And reputation was the armor that protected them. In 1916, with the economy beginning to recover, the Morning Star was stronger than ever. Catherine and Margaret bought the adjacent building, which was for sale, and transformed it into an extension of the boarding house. Now they had 19 rooms total. It was also in 1916 that they sought a lawyer for the first time. His name was Mr. Thomas Bradford, recently graduated, who had just opened an office in Portland. Catherine scheduled a consultation and got straight to the point. Mr. Bradford, my partner and I need to legally structure our businesses. We have properties, savings, and we want to ensure everything is perfectly documented. The lawyer spent the following months creating a complex legal structure. Each property was registered in both their names, 50-50. Each bank account was joint. Each business decision was documented in minutes, signed by both. Mr. Bradford, observing the meticulousness of the requests, began to understand he was dealing with something unusual. These two women were systematically intertwining their lives in every legal way possible, structuring everything so it would be impossible to separate one from the other. He never asked questions. He was a discreet and well-paid professional. But he kept the documents with special care, knowing that one day they might be important. In December 1918, the Spanish flu reached Portland. The port city was one of the hardest hit in America. Ships brought the disease from other countries, and the population clustered around the docks fell like flies. The Morning Star was hit hard. Of the 19 guests, 16 became ill. Catherine and Margaret transformed the boarding house into a makeshift hospital. Margaret, with her years of experience as a housekeeper, knew how to care for the sick. Catherine kept meticulous records of symptoms, medications, and each case's progression. They worked days and nights without stopping. They changed sweaty sheets, prepared broths, held the hands of those who were delirious with fever. 3 guests died, a 50-year-old merchant, a young pregnant woman staying with her husband, and an 8-year-old boy traveling with his family. Catherine and Margaret paid for the coffins, organized the funerals, wrote letters to distant families, and they continued caring for the survivors. In November 1918, Margaret became ill. Her fever reached 104 degrees Fahrenheit. She was delirious, vomiting, couldn't get out of bed. Catherine didn't leave her side for 4 consecutive days. She didn't eat, barely drank water, simply stayed there changing cold compresses, holding Margaret's hand and praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in. On the 5th day, the fever broke. Margaret opened her eyes, saw Catherine sitting beside the bed with an exhausted face, and whispered, "You're here." "Always," Catherine responded, and in that single word was contained all the truth they could never say aloud. Margaret's recovery took weeks. Catherine cared for her with a devotion that other guests admiringly commented on. "What a beautiful friendship," they said. "How lucky to have such a dedicated partner." They used the word friendship because it was the only word available. But Catherine and Margaret knew that what they felt for each other didn't fit in any word that society allowed them to use. When Margaret finally managed to get up and return to work, something had changed between them. The crisis had removed the last layers of formality they maintained even in private. Now there was no more pretense, only truth. At night, when they went up to the 3rd floor, Catherine sat beside Margaret and held her hand. They didn't say, "I love you," because those words were too dangerous, but they didn't need to. Every gesture, every look, Every decision made together was a silent declaration. Want to continue discovering how Catherine and Margaret built their empire and protected their love? Then subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss the next chapters of this incredible story. The 1920s brought great prosperity to Portland. The port grew, timber trade broke records, and the city modernized rapidly. Streetcars crossed the streets, new buildings were erected, movie theaters opened their doors. The Morning Star prospered along with the city. Catherine and Margaret, now 37 and 40 years old, had spent 9 years building their silent empire. Besides the main boarding house, they owned 3 buildings they rented to families, a small general store that supplied dry goods, and 2 lots strategically located near the waterfront. They had substantial savings at Portland First National Bank and an impeccable reputation. They were known as hardworking, honest, generous with the poor. There was never a scandal, never a complaint, never an unpaid debt. But vigilance over women living outside the norms was constant. In 1921, a new guest arrived at the boarding house. Her name was Mrs. Harrison. She was a widow, coming from Seattle to visit her married daughter in Portland. She would stay 3 weeks. Mrs. Harrison had a sharp tongue and eyes that missed nothing. She observed everything: how Catherine and Margaret looked at each other when they thought no one was watching, how they worked in perfect synchrony, how one knew exactly what the other was thinking without needing to ask. One afternoon, Mrs. Harrison was at the public market shopping when she overheard 2 vendors talking. "Do you know the Morning Star?" "I do. It's near the waterfront, isn't it?" "That one. It's managed by 2 women, single. They've lived together for years." "So what?" "They're partners. Partners who never married, who have no suitors, who've lived in the same building for almost 10 years. The vendor lowered her voice. "Don't you find that strange?" "What are you insinuating?" "I'm not insinuating anything. I just find it strange." Mrs. Harrison heard everything. She waited until the 2 women moved away, then picked up her purchases and returned to the boarding house as quickly as possible. That night, after dinner, she asked to speak with Catherine privately. In the small first-floor office, Mrs. Harrison recounted what she had heard. Catherine listened in silence, her face impassive, but her heart racing. When the lady finished, Catherine asked calmly, "And what do you think about this, Mrs.?" Harrison studied her for a long moment. "I think 2 hardworking, honest, and decent women don't deserve to have their names tarnished by poisonous gossip. I think what they do with their lives is their business. And I think that if they need someone to testify to their exemplary character, they can count on me." Catherine felt her eyes burn. "Why would you do this for us?" "Because I was also judged when I was widowed and decided not to remarry. People love to judge women who make different choices. Enough is enough." Mrs. Harrison became a friend and discreet defender. When she left 3 weeks later, she left her Seattle address and said that if they ever needed character testimony, they shouldn't hesitate to contact her. The incident served as a warning. Catherine and Margaret redoubled their precautions. They began attending more social events, always separately, always talking to other people. Catherine joined the Ladies' Presbyterian Guild, which did charitable work. Margaret began teaching home economics classes at the church for poor girls. Each action was calculated to build an image of respectability that functioned as a shield. And it worked. The gossip died before it spread, because Catherine and Margaret's reputation was too solid. In 1925, Catherine turned 42 and Margaret 45. They had spent 15 years together, building a life that needed to be constantly justified to the world. But that made perfect sense to them. That year they bought a larger lot, away from downtown, where they intended to build a house. Not to rent, not for business, but for themselves. "When we get older and can no longer manage the boarding house, we'll have our place," Catherine said as they signed the deed. "Our place," Margaret repeated, and the smile they exchanged contained decades of unspoken dreams. But dreams always came with reality. And reality was that they needed to remain vigilant, remain careful, remain protecting what they had built. In 1927, a new guest arrived at the boarding house. He was young, about 25, with black hair and sharp eyes. He said he was a writer, that he was in Portland researching for a book about life on the waterfront. His name was Richard, And he asked many questions about the boarding house's history, about how two women had managed to build such a successful business alone, about their families, about why they never married. Catherine and Margaret responded politely, but with rehearsed answers. We're business partners. Work occupies all our time. Marriage was never a priority. Richard stayed 3 months. During this time, he observed, took notes, asked more questions. There was something in his gaze that made Catherine uncomfortable, as if he were looking for something specific, as if he were assembling a puzzle. One night, Catherine found Richard in the hallway of the 2nd floor, near Margaret's room. It was late, almost midnight. He said he was just returning from the bathroom, but Catherine didn't believe him. She was certain he was spying, trying to catch some evidence of something that couldn't be proven. The next day, Catherine was direct. She entered Richard's room and said, "Mr. Richard, I've noticed you ask many questions about the boarding house's management. If you're interested in business, I can show you our account books. They're impeccable. If you're interested in something else, I suggest you look elsewhere." Richard smiled, but it was a cold smile. "Miss Catherine, I'm just a writer curious about interesting lives. 2 women managing a successful business is uncommon. Uncommon stories deserve to be told." "There's nothing uncommon about hard work and competent management," Catherine responded. "If you want to write about that, feel free. But I warn you that anything beyond the facts will be considered defamation, and we have a very competent lawyer." Richard left a week later. They never knew if he was really a writer or had other intentions. But the incident reinforced a truth they already knew. They would never be completely safe. There would always be someone watching, suspecting, trying to discover what was hidden. In 1929, the worldwide economic crisis hit America. Timber prices plummeted, companies went bankrupt, unemployment skyrocketed. Once again, many boarding houses and hotels in Portland closed their doors. The Morning Star, however, was prepared. Catherine and Margaret had savings, had diversified their investments, had rental properties that generated constant income. They went through difficulties, had to reduce expenses, but they survived. And they didn't just survive, they helped. They offered discounted rooms to families who lost their homes. They donated food to unemployed dock workers. They hired local workers for small boarding house repairs, even when they weren't urgent, just to provide work. Their generosity further increased their reputation. In times of crisis, Catherine and Margaret were seen as pillars of the community, as examples of work and solidarity. But behind the public facade, in the privacy of the 3rd floor, they were just 2 women who had found in each other something the world told them was impossible, a true, lasting love that faced all adversities, not with grand proclamations, but with daily choices to remain together. The 1930s brought significant changes to America. The Great Depression deepened, Roosevelt implemented the New Deal, and the country underwent profound social and economic transformations. Catherine and Margaret, now in their 50s, adapted as they always had. They formally registered the Morning Star, complied with all new labor regulations, officially hired registered employees. They now had 3 maids who helped with cleaning and cooking, and a young man who handled maintenance. The boarding house was now an established institution in Portland. Entire families lodged there generation after generation when they came to the city. Merchants had their favorite rooms reserved. The Morning Star's food was famous. The bread Margaret baked every morning, the strong coffee Catherine prepared, the hearty dinners served at 7 in the evening. But time was passing, and it made itself felt. Margaret, who had always had an iron constitution, began having joint pain. Climbing and descending stairs became more difficult. Catherine, who had perfect vision, needed glasses to read the account books. In 1935, Margaret had a high fever that lasted a week. It wasn't anything as serious as the Spanish flu of 1918, but it deeply worried Catherine. Dr. Miller, the physician who had treated them for years, recommended rest and less work. "You need to slow down, Miss Margaret. You're not 20 anymore." Margaret, stubborn as always, insisted on returning to work after 3 days. Catherine had to intervene. "If you don't rest, I'll lock the kitchen myself." It was the first time Catherine imposed her will so directly. Margaret, surprised, then smiled. "All right, I'll rest, but only if you also promise to do less. They hired another employee for the kitchen and promoted one of the longtime maids to supervisor. For the first time in 24 years, Catherine and Margaret began delegating more tasks. This gave them something they never had before: time. Time to sit on the porch on Sunday afternoons. Time to read newspapers together. Time to simply exist without constantly working. It was also in the 1930s that they finally decided to build the house on the lot they had bought years ago. It would be a single-story house, simple but comfortable, with 2 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, a living room overlooking a small garden. Construction took 2 years. Catherine and Margaret personally supervised every detail. They chose the tiles, the wall colors, the window shapes. It was their house, built exactly as they wanted. In 1937, the house was finished, but they didn't move immediately. The morning star still needed them, and the rhythm of life there was so ingrained it was hard to imagine living elsewhere. But the house was there, waiting. It was a promise of the future, a place where they could finally live without guests, without constant vigilance, without needing to maintain facades. In 1939, World War II began in Europe. America hadn't yet entered the conflict, but the effects were already being felt. Ships became scarce, international trade decreased, and Portland, dependent on the port, felt the impact. The Morning Star had to adapt again. Fewer international travelers, more local workers. Catherine and Margaret adjusted prices, economized where they could, maintained quality even with limited resources. It was during these difficult years that something unexpected happened. A young woman arrived at the boarding house asking for work. Her name was Grace. She was 18, came from rural Oregon, was pregnant, and had been expelled from home by her family. Margaret wanted to hire the girl immediately. Catherine hesitated, not from lack of compassion, but from practical concern. An unmarried pregnant girl would cause comments. But Margaret insisted. No one gave us anything when we needed it. We succeeded because we had courage and a chance. She deserves the same. Catherine yielded, as she always yielded when Margaret used that determined tone. Grace was hired as a kitchen assistant. When her belly grew too large for heavy work, she began caring for the linens. The baby was born in March 1940, a healthy boy Grace named Thomas. Catherine and Margaret provided a larger room for mother and son in the boarding house attic. They helped with clothes, with food, with the care a newborn requires. The boarding house guests noticed and commented, admiringly, about the owner's kindness. How many women would give work and shelter to a girl in that situation, they said. Miss Catherine and Miss Margaret have hearts of gold. What they didn't know was that, for Catherine and Margaret, helping Grace had a deeper meaning. It was helping someone who was outside social norms, someone who was judged for choices that society didn't approve. It was, in a way, helping themselves. Grace stayed at the boarding house for 3 years. When Thomas was 2 and she had saved enough, she left to start over in another city. But before leaving, she said something that left its mark. You ladies saved me when no one else cared. I'll never forget. If you're moved by this story of love, resistance, and solidarity, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of this touching journey. In 1942, America entered World War II on the side of the Allies. Portland, as the country's main Pacific port, became a strategic target. There was fear of bombings, food rationing, alert sirens that sounded in the middle of the night. The Morning Star lived through tense times. Some guests left, others arrived. Soldiers, civil defense workers, families fleeing smaller coastal cities. Catherine and Margaret kept the boarding house running, adapted to rationing, improvised with scarce ingredients. Margaret, who had always been creative in the kitchen, worked miracles with flour, beans, and whatever she could find at the market. It was during the war that Catherine began seriously thinking about retirement. They were now almost 60. They had worked non-stop for more than 3 decades. The house they built was empty, waiting. But Margaret didn't want to stop. The boarding house is our life, she said. What would we do without it? We'd rest. We'd take care of the garden. We'd read. We'd live. But we're living here too. We're working. It's different. The discussion remained unresolved. It wasn't a fight. They never really fought. It was just a difference in perspective. Catherine was tired, wanted peace. Margaret still found purpose in daily work. In 1945, the war ended. Portland celebrated with fireworks, church services, parties in the streets. Life was returning to normal, or at least to a new version of normalcy. The Morning Star survived once again. It was older, needed repairs, but remained standing, just like its owners. That year, Catherine did something she had been planning for a while. She reviewed all legal documents with Mr. Bradford, who was still their lawyer. Each property, each account, each investment was carefully registered in both their names. If something happened to one of them, the other would inherit everything automatically. Mr. Bradford, now a gray-haired gentleman who had known them for almost 30 years, asked, "This is very important to you ladies, isn't it?" "It's everything," Catherine responded simply. The lawyer understood what wasn't said. He nodded and guaranteed that everything was perfectly legal and documented. In May 1949, Margaret collapsed in the boarding house kitchen. Catherine, who was in the office, heard the sound of the fall and ran. She found Margaret on the floor, pale, unconscious. Dr. Miller came immediately. After examining Margaret, he called Catherine for a private conversation. "Her heart is weak, Miss Catherine. She needs absolute rest. No stress, no heavy work." "Will she be all right?" The doctor hesitated before answering. "If she rests, if she takes care of herself, she can live a few more years. But if she continues at this pace..." Catherine didn't need him to complete the sentence. That day, she made the decision alone. She would sell the boarding house. They would move to the house they built. Margaret needed to rest, and this time she wouldn't accept refusals. When Margaret woke and Catherine told her the plan, there were tears. "The boarding house is everything we built." "No," Catherine corrected, holding her hands. "We are everything we built. The boarding house is just a building." It took 3 months to find buyers, a young couple, newlyweds, who wanted to start a business. Catherine taught them everything about management, about the regular guests, about reliable suppliers. Margaret, already recovered but still fragile, taught the recipes, the kitchen secrets, the details that made the difference. In August 1949, they signed the sale. 38 years after buying that deteriorated building on Washington Street, Catherine and Margaret handed the keys to new owners. They moved to the house they had built years ago. It was strangely quiet after decades of a full boarding house. There were no guests calling, no meals to prepare for 15 people, no endless accounts to do. In the first days, Margaret didn't know what to do with herself. She walked around the house, fiddled with drawers, looked for non-existent tasks, but gradually, she got used to it. She began caring for the garden, planting roses and jasmine. Catherine read to her in the afternoons, as they did when young. At night, they sat on the porch and watched the sky. After decades of hiding, after years of constant care and vigilance, they could finally simply be. "Was it worth it?" Margaret asked one night. "Every second," Catherine responded. But time, which they had spent decades trying to control, had its own plans. In November 1949, Margaret had another cardiac episode. This time, she didn't survive. She died at home, in the garden she had planted, with Catherine holding her hand. Catherine was 66 years old, and for the first time in almost 40 years, was alone. She organized the funeral, notified acquaintances, fulfilled all social protocols. But inside, something had broken irreparably. 3 months later, in February 1950, Catherine died. Dr. Miller said it was her heart, but everyone who knew her knew the truth. She had died of grief, of a life that no longer made sense without Margaret. Mr. Bradford, as lawyer for both, opened the estate inventory process in March 1950. What should have been a simple procedure, 2 single women who were business partners, became something extraordinary when the documents were examined. 40 years of meticulously kept papers, property deeds always in both names, joint bank accounts since 1911, identical wills leaving everything to each other. Letters exchanged over the years, kept in a wooden box, where they referred to each other with tenderness that went far beyond business friendship. Mr. Bradford read everything and understood. Those two women had spent almost 4 decades building not just a commercial empire, but a life together. A life that needed to be legally structured so perfectly that no one could separate them, not even after death. The records never used certain words. They never explicitly said certain things. But the implication was there, in every line, in every explanation, in every decision documented over 38 years. The inventory took months to process. There were no direct heirs. Both families had long since distanced themselves. The estate was eventually donated to charitable institutions in Portland, as specified in the wills. An orphanage, a school for poor girls, the Ladies' Presbyterian Guild. But what remained, what really mattered, wasn't in the legal documents. It was in the story of two women who met in 1910, who built an empire from scratch, who faced economic crises, epidemics, wars, and social prejudice, and who never at any moment gave up on each other. Catherine and Margaret lived a love that couldn't be named, that couldn't be celebrated, that needed to be hidden behind formalities and business titles, but they lived. They loved. They built a life together against all odds. In Portland in 1950, when the inventory was finally closed, a few who read the documents understood what was implicit. Most continued seeing only 2 successful partners who had the luck to build a prosperous business. But the truth was there, preserved in decades of carefully archived papers, 2 women who loved each other deeply, who lived together for 38 years, and who structured every aspect of their lives so that, even if the world couldn't accept their love, at least it couldn't completely deny it. The Morning Star continued operating under new management for another 20 years. The building still exists in Portland, now transformed into an apartment complex. The house Catherine and Margaret built was sold decades later, and whoever lives there today doesn't know the story of its first residents. But somewhere in the Portland courthouse archives, in papers yellowed by time, is documented the story of Catherine Moore and Margaret Sullivan. A story of courage, of hard work, of resilience in the face of adversity, and more than anything, a story of love. A love that defied the conventions of its time, that existed in silences and between the lines, that was built not with grand proclamations, but with 40 years of daily choices to remain together, to build something no one could destroy. In 1911, 2 women bought a boarding house in Portland. In 1949, they had built an empire. But the true legacy wasn't in the properties, the savings, or the successful businesses. It was in the irrefutable proof, documented in every page of that inventory, that they loved each other with a devotion that crossed decades, crises, and all the hostility of a world that wasn't prepared to recognize what they had. And that, perhaps, is the greatest victory of all. Not just surviving, but leaving recorded, for anyone who had eyes to see, that their love existed, was real, and was as legitimate as any other, regardless of what words the society of their time allowed them to use.